From Los Angeles, California, the entertainment capital of the world, it's the 80s Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Edward Havens. Thank you for listening today. On this episode, we're going to tackle a movie from the early 1980s that, if made today with the same pedigree, would cause movie geeks and cinephiles to lose their frickin' minds over. But because this was made early in their careers, most people are only tangentially aware of its existence, let alone have actually seen it. We're talking about the 1986 Sam Raimi Coen Brothers collaboration Crimewave. But as usual, let's get to the backstory first. Any film fan worth his or her salt already knows the story of the making of The Evil Dead. How Raimi and Bruce Campbell made a proof-of-concept short film called Within the Woods to attract investors so that they could make a full-length movie. How they had to travel from suburban Detroit to Morristown, Tennessee to make the movie because it was the closest place with the kind of setting they wanted that they could afford, and how for most of the movie the entire cast and crew of the film had to sleep in the cabin they used to make the film. But what you might not know is that once filming was completed on The Evil Dead in January 1980, Raimi worked with a Detroit-based editor named Edna Ruth Paul to cut the film together, and that her assistant editor at the time was a 25-year-old NYU film school graduate named Joel Coen. Although Raimi's first impression of Coen was that of a weird, long, greasy-haired guy that he thought was going to rip him off or something, the pair would become friends during the editing of The Evil Dead, and Raimi would advise Coen and his younger brother Ethan, who was at the time working as an accountant at Macy's, on how they could shoot their own proof-of-concept short film to attract potential investors to their own first movie, Blood Simple. Joel was so especially impressed with what he had seen of Raimi's footage of The Evil Dead, both what made the final film and what got left behind on the proverbial cutting room floor, that the Coens would incorporate many of the same low-budget filmmaker tricks for their own film. Fast forward to 1983. It takes The Evil Dead a couple of years to find a distributor, with New Line Cinema signing on only after Stephen King had seen the film at the 1982 Cannes Film Festival and Market. King was there with George A. Romero to promote their movie Creepshow, and King had heard about this quirky little movie, and shortly after seeing the film, he proclaimed it to be, and I quote, the most ferociously original film of the year. Well, yeah, that would wake me up too if I was an acquisitions director at a distributor at the time. The Evil Dead was released in the theaters in mid-April 1983 and did okay for a low-budget horror film with no-name actors, earning $2.4 million from American cinema-goers, which isn't so bad for a movie that was released unrated due to the sheer amount of blood and gore, and never played in more than 60-something theaters in any given week. That was good enough for Raimi to be able to start taking meetings in Hollywood for his next film, and that film would be Relentless, a collaboration between Raimi and the Coen brothers about a pair of crazed hitmen who kill the co-owner of a burglar alarm company, then stalk the dead man's partner who hired them and the dead guy's wife, all while they frame a nerdy guy, the murders. Irvin Shapiro, a film representative who deserves quite a bit of praise for helping guide Raimi during the selling of The Evil Dead, liked the screenplay for Relentless but hated the title. Shapiro would come up with a new title for the film, The XYZ Murders, borrowing ideas from Samuel Z. Arkoff of creating a title for the film that would be more enticing to audiences even if it didn't have much to do with the film. Enter Norman Lear. Lear at the time was one of the most successful television producers in the history of the medium. Between 1971 and 1986, he had a string of ratings hits and critically acclaimed shows that changed the television landscape forever. Shows like All in the Family, Different Strokes, Good Times, The Jeffersons, Mary Hartman, Maude, and Sanford and Son. In 1982, Lear and his partner, Jerry Perenchio, bought many major studio Embassy Pictures for $25 million. And the one thing every studio needs year in and year out is more movies to distribute. And while Embassy Pictures in 1982 would end up releasing 13 movies, most of them were duds like Swamp Thing and Humongous. 1983 was looking pretty slim, and they had nothing on tap for 1984 yet. They needed movies, and they needed to make an impact in Hollywood. Quick. Like many in Hollywood, they had seen the box office grosses and critical reviews for The Evil Dead and brought Raimi in for a meeting. Raimi pitched them the XYZ murders. An embassy committed right there and then. They'd give Raimi and his partners $3 million to make the film. But there'd need to be some stipulations. First, they'd need to change the name of the movie. Again. Someone in the Embassy Pictures marketing department came up with Crimewave. It wasn't a bad title per se, and it did work within the context of the film. So now the movie was on its third title before even one frame of film had been exposed. And then there was Bruce Campbell. Even though he was the lead in The Evil Dead, one unnamed Embassy Pictures executive wanted Campbell to do a screen test for the leading role of Vic. The part Raimi and the Coens wrote for him. So Campbell would head over to a friend's photo studio and do a scene from the screenplay. And Campbell was rejected by the unnamed Embassy Pictures executive for the part that the Coens and Raimi had written for him. Instead, the studio insisted on Reed Birney to play the role of Vic. You know, Reed Birney. Now, this is nothing against Reed Birney, who is a very good actor, a Tony Award-winning actor, an adjunct assistant professor at Columbia University, and he's been on dozens of shows that you know, like 3 Different Law and Orders, Gossip Girl, The Good Wife, House of Cards, The Americans, The Handmaid's Tale, Succession, and Poker Face. But in 1984, he was a nobody, even less known than Bruce Campbell. The cast would still have some known actors. Louise Lasser, at the suggestion of Norman Lear, would be cast as Helene Trend, the wife of the late Ernest Trend, whose murder would set off the main storyline. Brian James had been featured in nearly 100 movies and television shows over the previous decade. He was best known for playing Leon in Blade Runner and Kehoe in 48 Hours. Paul L. Smith was, like James, another character actor who had been featured in dozens of movies and television shows, and at the time was best known for playing Bluto in Robert Altman's Popeye. And then there's Antonio Fargas, who, to this day, is still beloved by people my age for playing Huggy Bear on the 1970s television show Starsky and Hutch. But most of the cast would either be newcomers like Bernie or a number of inside casting. Edward R. Pressman, one of the executive producers of Crimewave, who would go on to produce films like Wall Street, The Crow, and American Psycho, would play the murder victim. Joel and Ethan Coen would make a rare on-screen appearance as reporters at the execution. Ted Raimi, the younger brother of Sam Raimi, would play a waiter in the film. Robert Tappert, a childhood friend of Raimi's who's been working with him ever since the proof-of-concept short film for The Evil Dead, plays a bar patron. And Frances McDormand would play a nun. Fun fact, before they were married, Frances McDormand and Joel Coen would share an apartment with Los Angeles with Ethan Coen, Sam Raimi, and Scott Spiegel, yet another childhood friend of Raimi's. Spiegel and Raimi have been working together since Raimi's first directing effort, It's Murder, was made in 1977. I guess that's 2 fun facts. The film would go into production in October of 1983, shooting mostly in and around Detroit, as well as in Los Angeles. And the shoot, according to a number of people involved in the making of the film, did not go well. Raimi wanted to use the Fuller Hotel in Detroit to shoot a number of scenes. In the 1920s, according to Bruce Campbell in his 2002 autobiography, If Chins Could Kill, the Tuller was the place in the city to be. In 1983, the hotel was run down and soon to become a retirement home for retired auto workers. For now, the hotel was owned by a couple of low-level local gangsters known as the Hughes brothers. Campbell and Robert Tappert were sent to talk to the guys about renting some space in the hotel for 2 weeks of shooting. Campbell and Tappert thought $10,000 would be a fair price. The Hughes brothers disagreed. So our guys doubled the offer, and the Hughes brothers politely declined. $30,000? A few weeks later, in the hotel's elegant ballroom, the Hughes brothers were having the time of their lives playing martini-drinking gentlemen in tuxedos, getting into several scenes as background players. Another scene shooting in Detroit involved the camera looking down on a car going across the Belle Isle Bridge over the Detroit River near downtown. Because it was late November and the temperatures that day had fallen to 30 below zero, the river was a sheet of ice. Since a frozen river was not a part of the story, Campbell and several Teamsters started to throw whatever they could find off the bridge to break the ice and get the shot. Rocks, tires, even cinder blocks. Nothing would make anything more than a small hole in the ice. Eventually, they used an explosive device called a primer cord to blow the ice up enough to get the shot. One actor tore up his hotel room in Detroit, saying the ghost of his girlfriend's ex-boyfriend was in the light fixtures, so they had to remove all of them. Another actor decided to do her own makeup for one scene and arrived on set looking like a rodeo clown, with snow-white face and huge patch of red lipstick around her mouth, completely inappropriate for the scene. Campbell, as one of the producers of the film, arranged for the makeup crew to quote-unquote touch her up before the scene was shot, so she didn't look like she was whacked out on blow. But the biggest problem for Raimi and the Coen brothers was that the script was too big for its nearly $3 million budget, and the film quickly went over budget and over schedule as the director found himself over his head with the complicated shoot. The film would crawl its way to the finish line in early January 1984, and Raimi, Campbell, and Tappert headed into their editing bay in Detroit to start cutting the film together. Usually the first cut of a film is called an assembly cut, which simply put is all the best takes of all the scenes shot, put together in order so the director and the producers can see what they have and start seeing what works and doesn't work. For a 90-minute film, an assembly cut could realistically run more than 3 hours as you were putting in every insert, every reaction shot, and every piece of second and sometimes even third unit shooting. And it can take several weeks to assemble. Then a director is usually given 2 or 3 more months to create their first cut of the film, to find the right timing, the right takes, and in a comedy like Crimewave to figure out if a specific joke might need an extra beat or two in anticipation of how an audience might react. But Embassy didn't even give Raimi the courtesy of finishing his assembly cut before telling him, Campbell, and Tappert to bring everything to Los Angeles so the distributor can oversee post-production. Raimi worked with 2 studio-approved editors who had a combined 1 film edited between them and added a pair of bookends to the film. New scenes that would play at the start and the end of the film to explain what was about to happen and wrap things up. You know, like this.
Yep, that's me. You're probably wondering how I ended up in this situation.
The studio would also replace Raimi's preferred music composer with one who knew nothing about the Crimewave team or their methods to their madness. And if all that wasn't bad enough, even after post-production was completed in the fall of 1984, Embassy Pictures sat on the film, despite having only released 2 films in 1984, This Is Spinal Tap and The Bear, and only having 3 films on their release calendar for 1985, The Sure Thing, The Emerald Forest, and the film adaptation of the smash Broadway hit A Chorus Line. And if that still wasn't bad enough, Lear sold Embassy Pictures to Coca-Cola, owners of Columbia Pictures at the time, in June 1985. And they turned around and sold Embassy Pictures to Italian mega-producer Dino De Laurentiis in October 1985. We've already done an episode about De Laurentiis and his eponymous studio that he would build from the ashes of Embassy Pictures back in 2020, so I won't get into many details here. But I will have a link to that episode at this part of the transcript to this episode on our website at the80smoviepodcast.com. When the executives at Columbia Pictures screened Crimewave for the first time in the fall of 1985, they were not impressed. But for some reason, they decided to keep the film for themselves when they sold Embassy Pictures to De Laurentiis, who would have been desperate for completed films to get his new distribution company geared up quickly. Columbia would, according to Bruce Campbell's autobiography, book the film in San Diego for a test run with the title Broken Hearts and Noses, but I can't find a single theater anywhere in the San Diego region playing a movie called Broken Hearts and Noses in 1985 or 1986. Also in his autobiography, Campbell says that in order to fill a minimum release commitment to the HBO cable movie channel, the film was only released in Alaska and Kansas. And once again, I cannot find a single theater anywhere in Alaska or Kansas ever playing Crimewave. But I was able to find 5 theaters that did open the movie on April 25th, 1986, in Carbondale, Illinois, Paducah, Kentucky, Palm Springs, Rapid City, South Dakota, and in my beloved Santa Cruz, California, at my beloved theater, the Del Mar. Although I was living in Los Angeles in April 1986 and I wouldn't work at the Del Mar for another 2 months, I do know for a fact that the Del Mar got print number 1 of the film, that it played for exactly 7 days, that a few of my friends went to see it that opening and closing weekend, and that the film grossed less than $900 for its entire week at the Del Mar, without any newspaper ads or pre-release trailers to let people know what the movie was about. Potential audiences either, like my friends, had to know what the film was already, or people who were glancing at the movie directory in the Santa Cruz Sentinel that weekend and decided to skip the new Tom Cruise movie Legend, and Lucas, a teen drama comedy featuring several featured Gen X movie stars like Winona Ryder and Charlie Sheen, the new Ron Howard movie Gung Ho, or the return of engagement of Martin Scorsese's After Hours for something called Crimewave. And people in Santa Cruz would not be alone in ignoring the film. Between the 5 theaters that did play Crimewave that weekend of April 25th, 1986, they would gross a combined $3,571, or roughly 9 people per screening per day. Little doubt the film would not get a second weekend at any of those theaters. So while the failure of the film was disappointing to Sam Raimi, Bruce Campbell, and everyone involved, it would ironically jumpstart Raimi's career. While waiting for Crimewave to be released, Raimi and Campbell redoubled their efforts to get an Evil Dead sequel off the ground. After Irvin Shapiro failed to get any international pre-sales for the potential film, when Shapiro tried to raise funds to make it at the 1984 film market under the title Evil Dead and the Army of Darkness. I'll have an image of the 2-page ad for that sales pitch on our website. Raimi and Tappert and Campbell were crewing up for a hopefully early 1986 start of production, even without the money in place, when fate intervened. One of the women they had interviewed for a prime position on the crew found herself in Wilmington, North Carolina, interviewing with Stephen King for a similar position on his then upcoming feature film directing debut, Maximum Overdrive, for Dino De Laurentiis' new company. The lady mentioned to King that they were having trouble raising monies to make Evil Dead 2. And at the end of their chat, King called De Laurentiis and told Dino he needed to find the money to get Evil Dead 2 made. A couple days later, Raimi, Tappert, and Campbell were at De Laurentiis' new studio lot in Wilmington, talking to the producer turned mogul in his gigantic new office. 20 minutes after the meeting started, the guys had their new film fully funded to the tune of $3.5 million, and they would begin shooting that film in the spring of 1986. So once again, you have Stephen King to thank for rescuing Sam Raimi and Bruce Campbell from obscurity. As of the writing and recording of this episode in May of 2024, there are a number of ways to watch Crimewave. If you subscribe to Amazon Prime Video, Fubo, MGM Plus, Night Flight, or Plex, you can watch it for free. You can also rent it for $3.99 from Amazon, Apple TV, Fandango at Home, or the Microsoft Store. However, I would highly encourage, if you've not done so already, to make sure you've activated your free subscription to Canopy through your local library and watch it there. Canopy has thousands of great movies from across the world and across the decades, and it's one of my favorite places to stream movies. That's Canopy with a K. Check it out. Thank you for joining us. We'll talk again soon. Remember to visit this episode's page on our website, the80smoviepodcast.com, for extra materials about the movies we covered this episode. The 80s Movie Podcast has been researched, written, narrated, and edited by Edward Havens for Idiosyncratic Entertainment. Thank you again. Good night.